Hello, environmental science class. This is the content video for Unit 3, Section 2. We're going to continue talking about ecosystems, and while last time we looked at how they're organized and the different levels inside an ecosystem, this time we're looking at how energy flows through that system of organisms. All right, so we talked about how they work together a little bit, and we already talked about how a food web works. We're going to continue expanding on that. Remember, I've already mentioned that the sun can be added to almost every single food web that we encounter or food chain. All life depends on the sun here on the surface of the earth, all right? And there is an exception. We'll talk about that. So that means that the sun gives off light energy, right, in the form of light. Plants use that energy in photosynthesis to create glucose, which they use for their own energy. And then herbivores or omnivores will both eat plants for energy. Remember, herbivores eat plants only. Omnivores will eat plants and animals. All right? And then the larger carnivores will continue to eat those herbivores or omnivores or other carnivores for their energy. So energy will flow through the system. Decomposers will break down a dead plant or animal matter, so they also will consume other biomatter, that's matter that was once living, but we usually don't consider those part of a food web because they aren't trying to kill other organisms. They take over after an organism has died. All right, the exception to that, I told you there was one. The exception is when there is no sunlight available. So at the bottom of the ocean, especially near volcanic trenches in the ocean, we have something called chemosynthesis that happens. You should remember this from biology, especially if you're taking my biology class right now, which some of you might be. Chemosynthesis is where the breakdown of sulfates and nitrates is used as a source of energy instead of light energy because there is no light, right? So very deep in the ocean, that's the other option, right? But as a general statement, we can think of all life on the earth depending on the sun. And the energy can also be represented in this, and it's called an energy pyramid. Before you get distracted by the fact that my face is over a word, that term is trophic levels. It's on the vocab list. I'll talk about it now, I promise. All right, so each of these levels in this pyramid, right, as we go from the bottom to the top, has some energy leaving. We can see on that side, I messed it up again. That side of the pyramid that there are these orange arrows that leave and it says energy lost. Right? Remember that the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can't be created or destroyed. So energy is not being destroyed here, but it is being used for purposes like movement or heat. Right? When you move around, you're using that energy. So that energy can't be consumed by something else if, you were eaten. So these nice little bunnies that we've got here are going to eat plants to get energy from the producers. They are called primary consumers. They also may be called primary consumers is the easy one. Let's stick with that. Now, if a predator or an omnivore were to eat those bunnies, like the snakes in this diagram, they will consume energy from the bunnies, but they aren't consuming all of the energy that the bunnies have consumed as well. So anything that the rabbit has used up, all that energy that the rabbit uses for moving around and creating heat energy, because the bunnies are warm-blooded, they're not cold-blooded, so they give off heat when their muscles contract and they move. So that energy does not enter the next step of the pyramid when we go from primary consumer to secondary consumer. So that pyramid gets smaller the higher we go up. And so that same principle will apply. These reptiles, however, aren't giving off body heat when their muscles move as much because they are cold-blooded. Right? So that energy loss is primarily from movement, not from heat generation, creating heat. right? So the energy loss is again represented as the pyramid gets tighter. The higher we go up, it is narrow. So tertiary means third, all right? And we've got a hawk or an osprey eating these snakes, all right? So the hawk isn't eating all the energy represented by all the plants that all the rabbits consumed, or all the energy that the snakes consumed when they ate all the rabbits, all right? Energy is lost throughout the chain here, all right? Now, there could be another level to this above the hawk if there were or osprey, I think it's an osprey. If there was something that ate that would be a quaternary, like quad 4, consumer. All right, so we've already talked about photosynthesis. That's the thing that plants use to generate something called glucose. Glucose is then used by the plant for chemical energy. So hopefully you kind of remember the photosynthesis equation. It looks like this. So we've got solar energy or light energy plus carbon dioxide that is absorbed from the atmosphere, plus water that's either absorbed from the atmosphere or the roots of the plant, is used in the light independent reactions and the Krebs cycle to create glucose. That's this thing, C6H12O6, plus oxygen. Right? And if you aren't a plant or bacteria that does photosynthesis, you only do cellular respiration, which is where you take glucose. That's from something you've eaten, right? Glucose is from something you've eaten, plus oxygen that you've breathed in. You've respired or aspired oxygen. And glycolysis, the Calvin cycle, and the electron transport chain happens, and you get carbon dioxide. That's what you exhale, you breathe out. Water, so you're either sweating that out or urinating it or breathing it, because we do breathe out water vapor. Plus chemical energy. That chemical energy is usually adenosine triphosphate, ATP, right? We've already talked about the first law of thermodynamics, where energy can't be created or destroyed. It's only used and transformed. So it's used to make heat, body heat, or used for movement, skeletal movement and muscle movement in mammals especially, creates heat as well. So that's what we're talking about when we say energy loss in a system, right? If you don't remember photosynthesis and respiration, that's okay. That's not the big push for this unit, all right? But here it is all laid out. If you want a copy of this, send me an email. I can give this to you, or just Google search photosynthesis and respiration in flowchart. You might find this one. I stole it off the internet. So not all energy is used as it is consumed. All right, so we have to figure out a way to store that energy. And then as the food chain progresses from the bottom, all those prosumers, up to the secondary and tertiary and quaternary even levels of consumers, something called biomagnification happens. All right, so we store this energy primarily in glucose, but also in fats, lipids. All right, glucose is a carbohydrate, it's a sugar, but for longer term storage, we're going to use fats. All right, so that is lipids in the macromolecule sense. All right, so if you're consuming something that's high in fat, you're consuming a lot of stored chemical energy, and the body has to work more to use the energy stored in fat. Right? It doesn't matter if you're a human or an animal. That's the same principle regardless. Biomagnification is, and I'm going to go back to this pyramid so that we can kind of talk about it. So biomagnification means that if there's anything in a material that's eaten, consumed, it may build up in the body, right? And this is especially true for things called heavy metals and some toxins where the body can't get rid of it. A lot of times it's stored in the liver, or the kidneys in humans and in other mammals that have livers and kidneys. So as that continues to go up the chain, right? So if, let's say, for instance, the rabbits here ate plants that had a pesticide on them, and that pesticide had a toxin, maybe it wasn't enough to really hurt the rabbits, all right? So the rabbits were fine because they didn't eat enough of the toxin, but it gathered up in their bodies. Well, snakes eat all of the rabbit, right? So they are eating all the chemical that those rabbits have already consumed. So they are having more of the chemical because they're not just eating individual little parts, they're eating a big chunk of it. And maybe their body also can't process this toxin out. So when the tertiary consumer eats them, that process continues. All right? So biomagnification is when one trophic level isn't as affected by a toxin or a heavy metal. That's generally the ones we care about. But the problem is passed up the chain to where it is concentrated and has a bigger effect. Magnification, bigger, like a magnifying glass. Right? And then I want to talk about a term that you might see called calories and kilocalories. So calories with a little c, a lowercase c in English, is a term that we use to measure chemical energy. And it's the energy needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. All right, now if you look at a food label, and you see a line that says calories, and it's got a capital C, that's 1,000 calories with a lower c. We could also call this a kilocalorie, kilo meaning 1,000. All right, like a kilometer is 1,000 meters, same difference. All right, so you might see sometimes this term to describe the energy stored in food, right? It may also talk about like the strength of a certain device to create heat, but that's an edge case. It's not as common. So we've got calories as a term for storing energy in food, but that's not just talking about fats for long-term storage. That's also talking about carbohydrates as well. Proteins have some energy in them as well. So if you're looking at a food label, especially, the calories for the food aren't just talking about stored energy as lipids. They're also talking about stored energy as carbohydrates and as proteins. All right. This is another way to look at that biomagnification concept, right? You may only have enough energy in a system to support a specific amount of organisms at each level, right? So there might be a lot of grass in this ecosystem, right? Maybe this is a woodland or a grassland. And there's a lot of that grass. So there's enough calories and nutrients to support a certain amount of primary consumers. This time it's grasshoppers or locusts, which is kind of redundant now that I think about it, right? But there's only enough grasshoppers to support a certain amount of birds, right? These secondary consumers, we can see the numbers are getting smaller and smaller, right? Underneath the producers, there's 1,000, but underneath the primary consumers, there's 100. But now under secondary consumers, there's only 10, right? But there's only enough of those small birds to feed one larger bird here, all right? That falcon can only eat so many of the smaller birds because there's only so many around, right? But what happens if we impact, say, the grasshopper population by spraying some insecticide? Insecticide is a chemical that kills or prevents the reproduction of insects. So if there's less of those primary consumers, right? If instead of there being 100 consumers, there's 50 primary consumers. That's a reduction of half, right? There's only 50% of what there was once. That means as we go up a level, there can only be 5 secondary consumers instead of 10, because 5 is less than 10. Easy enough. All right, but go up one more. Can you have half a bird? No. So having that impact in the lower levels can have a large impact on populations at the upper levels. All right, so removing calories, removing the energy in a system, because there's less population of a specific community, right, can have big effects on the overall food chain or food web. All right, so we talked about how energy flows through an ecosystem. It starts with the sun, or chemosynthesis, and continues through producers and primary consumers to secondary consumers to tertiary consumers and maybe even to quaternary consumers. All right. Usually there is kind of a limit in how big a food chain can be because there just isn't enough calories to go around to support the next level up because of this pyramid effect, right? It keeps getting smaller and smaller. And that's part of the reason why there just isn't predators for some of our top level consumers, because there's not enough calories to support that. All right, if you've got any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or drop into office hours. As always, hope you have a wonderful day.